So thank you for joining all to the second day of the Climate Social Forum 2021. We are starting now the second track that is about planet. And we are going to starting address the planet on a very interesting point of view with our first speaker of today, that is the keynote speaker of the session. It is Professor Eduardo Missoni from SaluteGlobale.it that will talk about One Health. He's an expert in planetary health and global health. And I'll give you directly the floor to him for this interesting topic and this interesting point of view also of talking about the planet. So, Eduardo, the floor is to you.
Thank you very much, Domenico. And I will try to start this presentation just underlining, highlighting the title that I wanted to give it, because it's One Health is the subject of our forum, but I would like to focus the need for a global dimension of this One Health. And then to see that if we want to reach a real approach and obtain a real change, achieve results, we really need a paradigm shift. So our history, I will start this like a novel. We are in the middle of a crisis, but this is a crisis which is long foretold, and you will discover why. And our history can start very, very many millions, thousands of years ago, with the beginning of the human evolution. But you will discover little by little why I want to start from there. Fundamentally, if we adopt an evolutionary perspective, we have increasingly more capacity in the human being that has been able to build his society, and this society has become progressively more and more complex, and man has started to organize in complex society, organizing around his work and the capacity to transform the planet where he is a host, together with many other beings on this planet. I mean, he is part of the life of the planet. I don't know. Okay, but now let's give some few definitions just to focus. When we speak of health, we speak of a fundamental human right. We speak of a complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. This is a very well-known definition of WHO. But we have to go beyond, because if we want to understand this complete state of social well-being, then we have to look into the determinants. Beyond the diseases, beyond our health conditions, we have to understand what has been called the causes of the causes, and that the wider set of forces that shape the condition of our daily life. And this obviously cannot be seen outside the forces that mold really the system, economic policy systems, actors, international actors, the agenda, the different social norms, the political systems that we live in. A traditional way of presenting determinants of health is in this beautiful diagram by Dahlgren and Whitehead, which stems from the 1990s, and shows very clearly that there are some proximity factors which influence our life conditions. Some of these are individual life factors that we imagine that we are able to control. But indeed, they are under strong influence, at least, of social and community networks in which we are embedded, and in many conditions of our society, which include education, employment, water and sanitation, healthcare services, agriculture. And on top of this, there is the system, the socioeconomic system, which together with the changing of the external environment influences our life. But I bring the perspective even further. I take you to the global dimension of these determinants, which we need to keep in mind as we live in a globalized society, and we cannot forget that it travels from one country to the other, that we eat the same products that has been produced maybe thousands of kilometers or miles away. So all this is really around us, and we will look at them as determinants of health. But then on top of what are called normally the social determinants of health, which indeed are social, economic, environmental, cultural, there is the global political system. And when I mean political, I mean the way that different forces work among them. We have been observing this outer circle in the distribution of health risks, which are very uneven, and the globalization, which means including free markets, we will see a global market, has really increased inequity in health around the world, and not only in health. And this is linked to the actors which have different degrees of power. And too often, health priorities are in conflict with other kinds of priority, other kinds of interest of the global political systems, such as, for example, protection of national security or sovereignty issues, or economic interests and goals. And we have seen this very, very clearly in the pandemic, where, for example, the hoarding of vaccines according to geopolitical decisions, or the impossibility today to travel from one country to the other simply because we have been vaccinated or non-vaccinated at all, and we cannot travel anymore because there are conditions which are posed. And if we are vaccinated with, say, with a China's vaccine, then we cannot travel to Europe, for example. So there are many factors which are to be read in the context of the geopolitical games, which have obviously different priorities, which are not health priorities. So many years ago, in the 1970s, the Club of Rome, which is a think tank of interdisciplinary think tank, commissioned to the MIT, to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, at that time possibly the most advanced center in computer science in the world, to study where humanity were going. And if we could, at that time we were in the middle of industrialization, the idea of development was economic growth and producing more and consuming more in order to promote economic growth, and to understand where we could, what we could achieve through that growth, how long it could be on that way. So to work on a mathematical model to look into the future. And the results of this was a report known as the Limits to Growth. And fundamentally, what this work produced was looking at the data from the beginning of the century, speaking of last century, to the time when it was, these data were analyzed in the 1970s, a certain trend could be observed in a number of parameters like non-renewable resources, food per capita, services per capita, pollution, industrial output, and population. Then they operated the mathematical model and tried to look into the future. And there we see the dotted lines. And what came out of this computer exercise was that somewhere around 2030, there would be a population decline following economic collapse and a number of other environmental crises, let's say a crisis of the whole system. What is dramatic about this trend is that when this was recalculated some 5 years ago, with much more powerful computer capacity, and using those data plus the experience between 1970 and 2015, and again, it was re-elaborated toward the future. Those data, you can see it from the solid line, were mostly confirmed. And approaching that around this time, around 2030, we are seeing more and more that the crisis, which was foretold, was in fact approaching very rapidly. We are fundamentally in the middle of the start of the crisis. A crisis which is related with our production system, with our development system. We have focused so much, and COP26 will focus even more on this. Actually, they have to come look what is happening. I mean, climate change is one of the issues that we are focusing on, and everything seems to start with greenhouse gas emissions, with effects on many different areas of human life, which at the end of the chain cause a number of diseases or health conditions that we have to face and that represent enormous challenges to humanity today. But we cannot focus only, too often, we focus only on climate change when we speak of the environment. Indeed, there is something more. There is a change in the ecosystem altogether. We cannot only look to the emission. We have to understand how our development model in which we are embedded, which is fundamentally based on economic growth, production, consumptions, and waste, is affecting the overall ecosystem. And the effects are under our eyes. It is traditionally we show, for example, glaciers that have changed their extension, and where there were ice, there may be water, or there may be just gray rocks. We have been observing, especially in the summer, enormous burning of land, and we may remember last year in Australia, enormous part of that continent, or in the boreal summer, the same happening in the northern hemisphere. And this has changed, obviously, and is changing the exposure to risks that we would not face before. For example, the change from south to north of certain diseases transmitted by vectors, because vectors now look for find a more appropriate climate to thrive in northern areas, and so floods and other disasters that we observe regularly. When I said we cannot focus only on climate change, is because our life today is embedded in a change, in a degradation, a transformation of the overall environmental system. The plastic issue is another one on which we focus we should focus much more, because it's not only about contaminating a place. There is a cycle which at the end is affecting not only human life, but as we well know, also animal life, for example, in the aquatic environment, but not only. So the planet is really now facing a big, enormous environmental crisis, which affects under many different aspects. Now here in the story, in our story, comes this little animal and say, so where do I come in? Because if we want to focus on One Health, we are indeed looking at how the human life interacts with animal life. With the pandemic, through the COVID-19 pandemic, or better say the SARS-2 pandemic, we have learned that, or we have been reminded how strict a relation there is between human life and animal life. And globalization has accelerated all this, because the promiscuity, the interaction between men and animal world has intensified. And this is very much related with the market and the market. And I make this difference. The markets are those places where people join, interchange, and possibly infect each other too. Today we learned this also. And where, for example, we have a certain kind of contact through consumption of certain animals, which normally are reservoir of their own diseases in the wild. This, by the way, it's not a Chinese market. Chinese do not consume bats, but in other Eastern countries, this happens. So consumption is just one, consumption, slaughtering, preparation of the food is one of the possibilities of entering in contact with the animal world. But there are other human activities which belong to the market. In other way, the way of interchanging products, of exporting and getting these products like in the timber industry, but all extracting industry, mining industry, think of oil, of other kind of minerals, which respond only to our development model, which is consume, 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 and therefore destroy, 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 use all the natural resources, and that you have to find in the middle of the forest sometime, where in the kingdom of the animals, in the kingdoms of other beings, in a complete different wild and natural world, where now the man penetrates and allows for more proximity with animals, and therefore allows the so-called spillover of certain microorganisms, mainly viruses, which are normally part of the life, or are endemic, if you want, among wild animals and domestic animals. And the more we get in proximity with these animals, the more we facilitate this spillover, which means, as we know, a virus or a microorganism that jumps from one species of the other. It breaks the species barrier. And that's why we have seen increasingly epidemics, outbreaks of diseases related to microorganisms that were not affecting men before. But when they became able to transform, to vary, then we have mutants that can affect men, and the immunitary system, the individual and the collective immune system is not prepared to face. And there we have the epidemics with a potential pandemic, with a pandemic potential. But the market is not satisfied. The market needs to produce more and more. And here we are intensive agriculture, which makes an enormous use of pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, which all enter our food chain, but not only our food chain, they enter the food chain of animals. They destroy insects, for example, that are pollinizers. So really we intervene with our powerful means in changing the environment. We do it for our increasing consumption. And then we also expose animals to situations that it's not natural to them either. We know the story of, for example, of chickens that are in chicken farms where the promiscuity among the animals is so strict that then you have to intervene in order to farm in this way, in injecting, for example, antibiotics. And here we have the results. That on our table, that poor animal that we shouldn't even think to eat actually comes with another challenge, the challenge of antimicrobial resistance. It's agriculture more than medical doctors, that has a responsibility in antimicrobial resistance, which is one of the future challenges, is one of the crises foretold that we have to take into consideration. And as you can see from this investigation of some years ago made in Italy, in the samples of this chicken coming in the supermarket, almost 100% of those samples were carrying some type of some genes carrying some type of resistance to antibiotics. And if we look more in our system, for example, the agricultural system, adopting a systemic vision, then we see how climate change is related through the effects of temperature and soil moisture in the change of the type of agriculture, may be leading to droughts and therefore to reduce farm yields, which impairs livelihoods, which has a tremendous impact on the nutritional status and therefore wider health impacts. But at the same time, crop farming, as I was highlighting before, with the use of chemicals, has impact on animal life, has an impact on our food chain, exposes us to chemicals that may produce cancer, and at the same time contributing through livestock production, for example, to methane and increasing the climate change potential. So we have to see this always in a systemic way and understand the overall impact. Now, many commissions, among these, the LANCET commissions, have been working on these aspects. So not only climate change, but pollution altogether. And pollution is killing many more humans every year than including the COVID pandemic. This commission and then WHO has further investigated, and just pollution kills more people than together AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. So we have to keep an eye on how we consume, because at the end of our consumption, at the end of our production cycle, there is waste, there is contamination, and there is consequences on the environment, as we already highlighted through these the impact on the environment, and for example the plastic challenge that I mentioned. It is therefore our consumerism, our system, which is causing consequences on health. Microplastic is just, I insist on this because it's an important component of our daily life. We have plastic everywhere, and we have now microplastics all over, filling the oceans. And obviously, what is pushing that consumption? It is marketing. And the new area that we have to be more sensitive to, we must care more, is, for example, the whole area of electromagnetic waste that also is insisting on our life. And it's not only our life. We now know more and more about the effect of electromagnetic fields on human health, but animals are also affected. And we are continually immersed, embedded in new powerful electromagnetic fields. We don't even know what are the possibilities. The market imposes our consumption. The market imposes us to increase waste. And waste affects human life not only through microplastic, but also through macroplastics, as it is shown in this picture. So deaths to pollutions, if we compare them with other risk factors, as you see, are very, very high and combined with a number of other risk factors. I'm not going more into detail. But what I want to stress is that when we speak of contaminants, we only know a few of them. At least we only have investigated and include in what is called the global burden of disease only the tip of the pyramid of the contaminants that are around. This means that in the market, in our consumption, it is still allowed to consume a number of toxins, of chemicals, etc., that simply because they have not been investigated or not enough investigated, we simply don't know the health effects, and therefore they are authorized. I mean, regulation only intervenes in what is known. Instead, we should focus on the precautionary principles and being able to look forward and say and think there are biological reasons, or there are, from a health point of view, physiopathological reasons that should suggest us not to consume certain products, not to use certain products. Instead, just in your home, just check in your bathroom, check in your kitchen, and have a look at how many products and chemicals are in our daily life that we do not control and we do consume. We breathe them, we eat them, we drink them. The consequence of this environmental change and of this influence on our consumption of the market and how it is a consequence on our health. And we have seen how increasingly non-communicable diseases has become the main part of the global burden of disease. And indeed, emerging communicable diseases may introduce some change. But today we are especially challenged by chronic diseases. And we should not forget that this is the main epidemic that we are living through. Indeed, if we look of the leading causes until 2019, we still don't have the data to put in these statistics COVID-19, but you can just look at the number. We know when we speak of possibly 2 million, 3 million of deaths, and look at how many deaths you have just from, 2 million of deaths with COVID, and then we are looking at 9 million of deaths from ischemic heart disease, or stroke is over 6 million, and still in poor countries we have to face neonatal conditions, especially lower respiratory infections, still children dying from diarrheal diseases, and millions of children dying from malaria and diarrheal diseases and other diseases which are common in poor countries. The problem is that we are going more and more into the market issue, and it is the WHO that told us, beware, that if the industry comes into shaping public policies, then you will any interest in control measure will be downplayed, because these forces Sorry, I was muted. Now should be able to hear me again.
No, it's okay. Thanks.
Thank you. The WHO has pointed out that when the industry enters in the policy making, and this is more and more common, look at the idea of global public-private partnerships, the role that the private sector plays and has played, including in this epidemic, in this crisis. When it is the private sector, it is the pharmaceutical industry which decided what would be the rules of the game. For example, not accepting liability about the production of vaccines. There you have the private interests molding the public interest, and there you are weakened. The public sector is weakened. It is not more able to control this phenomenon. And this is what needs to be avoided. There is where policies must come back and be restored in the hand of the public interest and facing this enormous challenge of the private interest. And here we can make some jokes on it. We can see the disease-mongering attitude of pharmaceutical industry. The best business for pharmaceutical industry is to have drugs which can be given to healthy people forever. That is what they're looking for. That is their business. Actually, vaccines may respond to this strategy. That is why we have to find a way to prevent diseases through improving health conditions, improving the system in which we live. We cannot leave the solution to technicians. We cannot leave the solution to biomedical research only, or even worse, to the pharmaceutical industry. And on the other side, you see this other comic as the industry, also food industry and chemical industries and others are not interested in prevention at all. We live in a cancerogenic societal model. Profit maximization and the externalization of social environmental costs, which means the cost of social and environmental degradations are on the community, are not on the industry who produces, are not on the industry who makes profit out of it. And they're interested in having us not as citizens, but as consumers. And the examples are in front of our eyes. Agribusiness, big food industry, emissions which are related to other kind of industrial production, as I meant before, mining industries and others. And there is this nice study by Luzzati in 2018, which shows that the increase, if our goal is just the increase of gross domestic product, this is influencing many aspects of our life. And at the end, cancer is kind of the result through the increase in pollution, through the modification of our lifestyles. And in the slides, I added marketing, because it's not only consumptions, it's also strategies which want us to consume more and more. So all this must be kept in mind when we try to understand what is happening to humanity. What has been described the Anthropocene, this new geological era where we are now living through. And this is very much this cancer society that I described. So from an evolutionary perspective, we observed some changes, and maybe this is the way that we are going. And obviously, there are some big risks in this kind of evolutionary perspective. And then here we have this little girl, now it's world famous, say, but this is just the beginning. And I really don't know if this is just the beginning of the crisis or the beginning of the fight of the people of civil society moving to control all this, or possibly both, because this is also a cycle that we have to govern. We cannot accept anymore that the crisis becomes deeper and deeper. We cannot remain blind in front of the crisis. So we need what I called and put in the title of this presentation, a paradigmatic shift. We need to really change the way we live. We have to go back to health understood as a social well-being, but we need to expand our vision. We cannot be just man-oriented. We need to expand and looking at the system in our natural world where we, as I said, we are purely guests. We cannot go on with the trend that we have started possibly with the beginning of industrialization. We have been accelerating this trend through globalization. And if we go on with the same way of production, of consumptions, of producing waste, well, we will not be able to correct the problems that we are facing. We cannot, with the words attributed to Albert Einstein, go on using the same tools to resolve the problems, because insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results. It's like, if you want, not understanding how the viruses are changing, and we cannot face them always with the same vaccine. And somehow we have to understand that we have to change the terrain. We have to change the medium in which diseases, not only viruses, all kinds of diseases are thriving. There is some intent at the policy level with the health in the Agenda 2030. And as we know, it's combined in the number of different sustainable development goals. They are combined with many other goals. But this agenda somehow is a little bit forgotten, I have the sense, because we still discuss in different aspects and don't understand the indivisibility of these global goals. We don't understand that this should be really a universal commitment, and we don't understand that there is some contradiction in all this agenda, especially if let's focus on the objective and the Sustainable Development Goal number 8, which says that we want to achieve sustained and sustainable economic growth. And this is not possible. We have seen that economic growth alone as a criteria for our human progress is bringing only problems, because it's increasing our aggression on the natural system. It's an oxymoron to think that this is possible. Sustainability cannot go together hand in hand with the expansion of the economy, of the idea that we have to grow and grow, because growing and growing means only increasing consumption. We have to find a way of consume less and better. So we know to looking into solutions. There are some ideas, and I'm sure that during our forum we will go more in depth in finding what can be the local experiences which connect with the global environment. Policies, try internalization of the environmental cost that has been externalized until now, more awareness through labeling, entering hard with the regulation from the public actors. But the problem, as we have seen, is really this hybridization of our interests, with the private sector entering very strongly in molding our policies. And there is where we need much more of a reflection, understanding how public interests, the common interests, the common goods can be defended. So we really have to understand, including this pandemic should open our eyes and show us that we are in the middle of the crisis of the system. It's not just a coronavirus infection. This is much more, is what has been called a syndemic, where the system is part of this epidemic. And this is what leads us to a different approach in our Anthropocene era. We need to have one perspective which brings one health. We cannot forget the environmental issues and separate them from the human issues, or separate them from the animal issues. And we have to have build up the capacity to have this systemic look. And I just add to this the global dimension. I believe that we need a global One Health approach. We cannot think only of our local action, forgetting that we are in the middle of a globalized world, and therefore civic action, civic engagement must engage in the global dimension, because it's a global dimension that more and more is in global interests and global forces that are more and more influencing our daily life. So one global health to me means engaging for equity worldwide, using a systemic approach, which has also been defined, One Health has also been defined as a whole of society, whole of government. So we cannot, health going separately from environmental policies, or separate from industrial policies, or separate from educational policies. We have to have this whole of society approach. understanding the global determinants, and then adopting integrated solution. So the One Health perspective is really a fundamental part of global health and has something more. As the Greta Thunberg was teaching us, there is an intergenerational aspect in it. We need to be able to connect the experience of the older people with experience of the younger people, and thinking of those who have to come. And to conclude, will be necessary to look into a new space odyssey. In other words, this planet will not be able to satisfy our needs, and we will have to look at to colonize other planets. It's one of the hypotheses of Stephen Hawking. You remember the famous astrophysician that died a few years ago, became famous for being for living through a very serious disease. He says, maybe at some point, if we go this way, the planet will be not enough anyway, and some people will be able to go and colonize other planets. Is this a solution? Or we should suggest to humanity, better go back. That is not the way we have to follow. I believe we need to have a way forward. I believe we have to care for this planet. We have to care through a One Health approach. We need a utopia for a different society, which is fair, inclusive, cooperative, let me add, transparent, just, equitable, ethical, ecological, a human society where really there is space for everybody. So we need to look forward. But let me remind, if we want to look forward, we need to have a project. Therefore, with my countryman Antonio Gramsci, I would say, educate yourself because we will need all your intelligence. Get excited because we are going to need all your enthusiasm. Get organized because we are going to need all your strength, the strength of all the citizens of this world who are interested in improving human life and health and ensure health for all at all ages, not only today, but forever. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Eduardo. It was very amazing and inspiring speech. So thank you very much. A pleasure and an honor to have you here. So maybe if there are some questions, we have a small space for questions. And then, as I said at the beginning, we have like a round table after the speech properly on the topics of One Health, sanitation, and also the relationship between human health and environmental health. But before that, please, if there are some questions for Eduardo, please go ahead. I will report one that is from Lily for the slides. I think that Eduardo already sent us the slides, so we'll get them available also for the participant to the Climate Social Forum. So
I see there is also an offer for collaboration. So I will be very, very glad to collaborate with anybody. And Domenico, you are allowed from now to pass my email to whoever may be interested in establishing contact and bringing forward this reflection that we need to do all together.
Okay, super, perfect. Okay. Just call if there are other questions, even though we